Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight, we're not talking about knights in shining armor or damsels in distress. Forget the Disney version, toss it into the nearest, conveniently located medieval sewage ditch. We're diving headfirst into a corner of history so murky, so devoid of anything resembling modern decency, that it makes your current dating woes look like a walk in a perfectly manicured, plague-free park. We're talking about the medieval marriage market, not the one where lords arranged alliances over wine and conquest, but the grimy, desperate version among the common folk. You think divorce is a headache, with lawyers, court fees, and splitting the streaming service passwords. Back then, if you were a peasant sometimes, just sometimes, your marriage contract felt less like a sacred vow and more like. Well, chattel, there are accounts, whispers in the historical wind of men literally selling their wives, like livestock, leading them to market with a rope, standing them next to the pigs and the potatoes, and auctioning them off to the highest bidder. Let that sink in. Your partner, your life companion, potentially sold for a few coins and a couple of chickens. This isn't a cozy history lesson. This is about waking up to the brutal truth of what life was actually like when most people own nothing, and that included their own bodies and destinies. Prepare to feel deeply uncomfortable. Before we plunge into this particular hellscape, hit like and subscribe, but only if you're ready for history's ugly truth served raw and bleeding. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what price you think you'd fetch on the medieval wife market. Now, dim the lights, brace yourself, and step into history's darkest corners, where human dignity was a luxury nobody could afford. Let's get one thing straight. Formal, church-sanctioned divorce for the common folk, practically non-existent. The church saw marriage as a holy sacrament, a binding contract for life. For peasants scraping by in the mud, living hand-to-mouth, the church's pronouncements on eternal unions often felt about as relevant as a royal decree on proper jousting etiquette. Their reality was governed by dirt, debt, and the desperate need to survive. Marriage among the poor was less about starry-eyed romance and more about forming an economic unit. You needed a partner to work the field, share the meager food, and produce more hands for labor. Love. That was a luxury few could afford, let alone rely on when starvation was a constant companion. Imagine the smell. Damp earth, stale sweat, animal dung, and the ever-present, cloying scent of poverty and fear. Your clothes were rough wool or linen, rarely washed, scratching your skin raw. The soundscape was the wind whistling through leaky huts, the bleating of sheep, the distant, menacing baying of the Lord's hounds, and the muffled cries of children who were always hungry. Women, legally and socially, were often seen as property, first of their fathers, then of their husbands. The idea of a woman owning land or having any independent legal standing, mostly laughable. Dower rights existed, theoretically protecting a widow, but enforcing them without power or connections was often impossible. It was less, till death do us part, and more till one of us dies, runs away, or gets sold because we can't afford the harvest tithe. They called it life. It felt a lot more like slow decay. You think your relationship has power imbalances. Try being literally considered part of your husband's movable goods, alongside the scrawny chickens and the rusty hoe. This wasn't universal law across all of Europe, mind you, but in places like England, particularly among the lower classes, custom and desperation sometimes created a terrifying loophole in the absence of accessible legal or religious recourse for unhappy or economically unviable unions. Still think your breakup was tough? At least you didn't end up tethered to a post with a rope around your neck while strange men poked your teeth. You thought laws were neat, tidy things written down for everyone to follow, adorable. For the vast majority of medieval peasants, the king's law or the pope's law felt distant, irrelevant, or stacked entirely against them. Accessing formal legal systems or church courts for something as complex as ending a marriage, That cost money, connections, and travel, things a starving farmer with worn-out boots simply didn't have. Annulments existed, sure, but they were granted for specific, narrow reasons like consanguinity or non-consummation. Proving these required witnesses, bribes, and navigating a labyrinth of ecclesiastical bureaucracy designed to keep the poor outside. For your average couple who just couldn't stand each other, or more commonly, couldn't survive together because one was sick, barren, or just useless in the fields, there was no official exit ramp. So where formal law failed or was simply inaccessible, local customs, often born out of desperation and grim practicality, sometimes filled the void. This is where the murky, unsettling accounts of wife selling emerge. It wasn't recognized by the king's court or the bishops. It was a desperate, extra-legal transaction among the lowest classes, a dark workaround when official channels were impossible. It was less about the woman's consent and more about the transfer of a perceived economic burden or asset from one man to another. Consider the legal concept of feme covert prevalent in English common law. When a woman married, her legal identity was pretty much subsumed by her husband's. He controlled her property, her earnings, and had legal rights over her person that are, frankly, horrifying by modern standards. She was, in many ways, legally invisible without him. This legal framework, designed to protect property and lineage among the wealthy, trickled down in perverted ways, contributing to the idea that a wife was less a partner and more a possession. Imagine the chill seeping into your bones in a drafty, mud-walled hut, the only warmth coming from a meager, smoky fire. The rough texture of sackcloth on your skin, the constant ache in your limbs from back-breaking labor. Survival wasn't a guarantee. It was a daily battle against cold, hunger, and disease. In this world where people sometimes sold themselves into temporary slavery just to eat, the idea of selling a spouse who wasn't contributing or worse was a drain on resources becomes a grotesque, albeit understandable, act of last resort born of utter desperation, not sanctioned law. They called it necessity. You'll probably call it something else, something much less polite, as your comfortable modern worldview gets kicked in the teeth. All right, so you've accepted that formal divorce was a non-starter. Now let's talk about the horrifying alternative that sometimes popped up in the muddy, unwritten rulebook of peasant life. We're talking about the market day sale. It wasn't a legal proceeding with robed judges. It was a transaction conducted among the livestock, the vegetable stalls, and the general chaos of a medieval fair. Think less courtroom drama, more cattle auction, but with slightly more emotional baggage if you could afford emotion. Picture the scene: a bustling market square reeking of animal dung, stale beer, unwashed bodies, and muddy earth. The air buzzes with the shouts of vendors, the bleating of sheep, the occasional squawk of a goose. Amidst this vibrant, filthy tableau, a man appears leading his wife. Not by the hand like a partner, but often, according to the accounts and folklore, with a rope or a halter around her neck or arm. A symbol of ownership, plain and simple. This wasn't a performance for sympathy. It was a public announcement of intent. This asset was available for transfer. The woman, probably dressed in worn, rough-spun clothes, would likely be disheveled, humiliated, her face a mask of despair or blank resignation. Her fate wasn't in her hands. It was a transaction between men, facilitated by custom and desperation. The buyers weren't always looking for a wife in the romantic sense. They might need a laborer for the fields, a housekeeper, someone to care for children, or simply a partner who came without the hassle of courtship or negotiation with a protective father, assuming she wasn't already married. The price varied wildly. Sometimes it was symbolic, a shilling or two, just enough to validate the transfer in the eyes of the witnesses. Other times, it might involve a sum to pay off a debt, or perhaps just a few beers and a handshake. Think of it as the ultimate dirt cheap, no warranty pre-owned human. This custom, though never universally accepted and often frowned upon even at the time by those who actually did follow the rules, thrived in the legal vacuum of peasant life. Where the official system offered no solution for an untenable marriage, and where poverty meant every mouth to feed needed to earn its keep, desperate people did desperate things. The texture of that rope rough against skin, the sound of the indifferent crowd's chatter, the smell of the market mingling with the cold dread. This was the reality of a marriage dissolving, not in a lawyer's office, but in the public square for sale. They called it a solution. It was a degradation. Still thinking your dating app profile is challenging, at least nobody's putting a literal price tag on you next to a prize-winning pig. You heard right, this wasn't some quaint local tradition universally practiced or legally sanctioned by the crown or the church. In fact, the church absolutely hated this stuff. They saw marriage as indissoluble, a sacred bond made before God. Selling your wife like a side of bacon was, to them, a blasphemous affront to divine law and common decency. Priests would preach against it, threatening eternal damnation and temporal punishment. But their power in the muddy, distant villages, miles from any bishop's watchful eye, was often limited. They could admonish, they could excommunicate, but they couldn't force peasants who had nothing to suddenly find legal funds for an annulment or magically reconcile when starvation was knocking. The church's condemnation was clear, but their reach only extended as far as their influence and the lord of the manor allowed. Think of it as medieval virtue signaling versus medieval survival strategies. Survival usually won. The royal courts, even less interested, unless the sale somehow involved land, inheritance among the minor gentry, or caused a serious breach of the king's peace like a riot or a murder. For Sir Roger, the traveling justice, the plight of two peasants swapping spouses for a sack of grain was beneath his notice. His concern was property disputes among those with property, criminal matters that threatened order, and collecting fines for the king. Your broken heart or your broken marriage, not his problems. Evidence for these sales isn't usually found in neat, official court records detailing the transfer of one female spouse, slightly used. Instead, it pops up in manorial court rolls dealing with related issues, in later legal cases where descendants tried to sort out inheritance tangled by such informal arrangements, in ballads, folklore, and the diaries of slightly scandalized observers. It's the history found in the cracks, the desperate measures taken when the system offered no other way out. These weren't just financial transactions, they stripped the woman of any remaining vestige of autonomy. Under Feme Covert, she had minimal rights, but in a sale, she was reduced to an object of exchange. Imagine the feeling of helplessness, the taste of dust and shame in your mouth as you're paraded, the rough textile of your only decent dress scratching against your skin. The sounds weren't just market noise. They were the muffled whispers, the cruel jests, the utterly indifferent silence of those who saw this as just another hard fact of a brutal life. They called it practicality. It was the erasure of a human being. Your online dating profile bio feels less significant now, doesn't it? You think people did this because they just fell out of love? Please. Modern relationship problems are a luxury. The reasons behind these desperate acts were brutal, practical, and soaked in the cold reality of medieval economics. It wasn't about finding someone new. It was often about survival, pure and simple. Imagine living your life entirely dependent on a patch of dirt and the unpredictable whims of the weather. One bad harvest, one blight on the crops, one unusually harsh winter, and your family faced starvation. Suddenly, that extra mouth to feed wasn't a partner, it was a liability. Historical records show that one poor harvest could literally wipe out a peasant family's food stores for the entire year. This wasn't theoretical hardship. It was the sharp, biting edge of death itself. Maybe the wife was ill, unable to work the fields or tend to the livestock. In a world where manual labor was essential for survival, an unproductive partner wasn't just a burden. They were a potential death sentence for everyone else in the household. Think about the rattling coughs, the weak limbs, the inability to lift a hoe or knead the meager bread dough. Compassion was hard to come by when everyone was fighting to stay alive. This wasn't seen as abandoning a loved one. It was often viewed through the grim lens of economic triage. Then there were the demands of the lord of the manor. Feudal dues weren't optional. Whether it was rent, a portion of the harvest, or specific taxes like tallage or shevage, the lord would get his share. If the harvest was poor and you couldn't pay, the consequences were severe: eviction, starvation, or worse. Selling an asset, even a human one, might be the only way to scrape together the coins or goods needed to satisfy the lord and keep a roof over your head, such as it was. The texture of poverty was rough, like perpetually empty pockets and calloused, trembling hands. Being barren was another potential reason, though complex. While not always grounds for a sale, the pressure to produce heirs or simply more hands to work was immense. A woman unable to contribute labor and unable to bear children could be seen as a double economic blow. It wasn't about disappointment. It was about a failed investment in the brutal arithmetic of peasant life. They called it misfortune. For the woman, it was a potential death sentence or a life of abject dependence. Selling wasn't the first choice. It was the last-ditch effort when all other means of survival had failed. It was the medieval equivalent of pawning your spouse to pay the rent and buy some food. They called it making do. It was a profound, soul-crushing failure of society and humanity. Still think your reasons for breaking up are complicated? Try needing to afford dinner. You're about to see how this grim transaction actually went down. Prepare to feel even worse. Right, let's rewind back to that market square. This wasn't some backroom deal shrouded in secrecy. The whole point of the rope, the public display, was to make it visible. It was a crude public declaration that the original contract was null and void in the eyes of the community, if not the law. Everyone saw it. Everyone knew. The man would lead his wife, often with that halter, to a prominent spot, sometimes near the livestock pens, other times near the market cross or a large, well-known tree. This wasn't just symbolic. It was part of the ritual, a way to draw attention and signify the nature of the transaction. The smell of wet straw, manure, and muddy boots would fill your nostrils, mixed with the sharp tang of wood smoke from cooking fires. The sound was a cacophony of haggling voices, animal sounds, and the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer. He would announce his intention, often in simple, direct terms. He was offering his wife for sale to anyone who would take her. This wasn't poetry. It was a raw, transactional announcement. The price might be stated up front, or the man might invite bids. Sometimes the buyer was already known, an agreement having been reached beforehand, and the public display was just the final, humiliating ceremony. The woman herself might be utterly silent, or she might be crying, pleading, or simply standing with a dead, vacant stare. Her feelings were irrelevant to the transaction itself. Consider the markets of places like Smithfield in London, though the rural markets were the primary stage for peasant life. These were centers of commerce, but also hubs of social interaction and apparently deeply unofficial relationship dissolution. The texture of that rope in the husband's hand or around the wife's arm or neck wasn't just fiber. It was the physical manifestation of her status, property being transferred. The light in the market square was often dim, broken by shadows cast by stalls and crowds, adding to the oppressive, bleak atmosphere. The buyer could be anyone looking for a laborer, a companion, or simply taking advantage of a desperate situation. There are accounts suggesting the wife's consent was sometimes obtained beforehand. But given her legal powerlessness and economic dependence, consent in this context was likely coerced or given out of utter despair and lack of options. It was less, do you agree, and more, is this slightly less awful than starving alone? They called it a fair exchange. It was a public act of dehumanization. Still think online dating is degrading. At least your profile photo isn't taken with a rope around your neck in a field full of sheep. You've seen the sale. Now let's talk about what happened after the auctioneer's mental gavel fell. So the deal is done. A few coins exchange hands, perhaps a round of drinks, maybe a chicken or two thrown in to sweeten the pot. The original husband walks away, lighter in his purse but perhaps heavier in his soul, or maybe just relieved to have one less mouth to feed. And the woman, she walks away with her new owner. Not into a life of ease and comfort, obviously. This wasn't a rescue, it was a transfer of misery. The marriage that followed wasn't recognized by any priest or parchment. In the eyes of the church and formal law, she was still married to the first guy. This new arrangement was a common law marriage of the most brutal kind, based on cohabitation and community recognition among the poor, utterly devoid of the religious or legal protections of formal matrimony. She might be called his wife, they might live together, but it was a ghost marriage, invisible to the powers that be. Life with the new husband would likely replicate the grim conditions of the old. Same backbreaking labor in the fields, same constant gnawing hunger, same drafty hut smelling of damp earth and poverty. Her status hadn't fundamentally changed. She was still a laborer, still a domestic worker, still property in the eyes of the man who now controlled her life. The texture of her rough clothes, the feeling of weariness deep in her bones, these didn't magically disappear. This was a world where women had vanishingly few rights. The legal system offered no protection against spousal abuse, exploitation, or abandonment. If the new husband was cruel, if he was poor, if he decided he didn't want her anymore, her options were non-existent. There was no calling a sheriff, no appealing to a judge. Her recourse was prayer, running away, or hoping for death. They called it settling down. It was just swapping one cage for another, perhaps slightly less awful or slightly more. The lack of legal recognition also meant any children born from this union could face issues with legitimacy and inheritance later on. Though among the lowest classes, formal inheritance wasn't always a complex affair anyway. There often wasn't anything of value to inherit but misery and debt. Still, it added another layer of precariousness to an already unstable life. Imagine the silence of walking away from the market crowd, the only sound the crunch of mud underfoot, the weight of an uncertain future settling heavily on your shoulders. They called it a fresh start. It was a continuation of powerlessness under a different name. Still think your relationship problems are complicated? At least you probably won't end up in a common law arrangement nobody recognizes after being sold in a market. Now you know how they were sold. Let's talk about how often this horrifying practice actually happened. Okay, so how widespread was this charming practice? Was it happening on every street corner every Tuesday? Thankfully, no. This wasn't like paying taxes or getting baptized. It wasn't a universal, legally recognized part of medieval life across Europe. If you were a wealthy noblewoman, your fate was grim in other ways, but you weren't getting paraded with a rope in the market. The accounts of wife selling are most strongly associated with England, and seem to become more prevalent in the later medieval period and early modern era, specifically among the laboring classes. Think of it as a desperate, informal custom that bubbled up from the bottom of society, ignored or condemned by those at the top. It was a symptom of economic collapse and legal exclusion, not a sanctioned tradition. Evidence isn't found in formal legal documents detailing the sale deed. You won't find King Edward III signing off on a bill of sale for one John's wife Alice. The records are scattered. Mentions in manorial court roles dealing with related disputes. References in diaries or letters of those passing through rural areas, folklore, ballads, and later legal cases trying to unravel the mess left by such unofficial unions. Its history found in the cracks whispered accounts of the lowest of the low. It's crucial to understand this wasn't the only way poor people dealt with bad marriages. Desertion was common, one partner simply vanishing into the vast, indifferent landscape, hoping to start over somewhere else, often under a false name. Separation by mutual agreement also happened, where a couple just stopped living together. A de facto divorce the law didn't recognize but often tolerated if it didn't cause trouble. Wife selling was one of the more extreme, public, and degrading methods. The sounds of gossip and hushed condemnation would follow such a transaction. The smell wasn't just the market. It was the heavy odor of stigma clinging to the woman and her new partner. The texture wasn't just the rope, it was the feeling of being utterly exposed, judged, and disposable. This practice wasn't sanctioned. It was endured, a grim testament to how far people would fall when society offered them no legitimate path out of misery. They called it an old custom. It was a horrifying reflection of how little value was placed on certain human lives. You've heard where and when this happened. Now let's talk about the shocking things that went on during the auction itself, because yes, it gets worse. You thought the idea was bad? Wait till you hear about the performance. This wasn't a quiet exchange in a back alley. The whole grim spectacle often took place in the most public spot available, the bustling market square. Because nothing says fresh start like being auctioned off next to the turnips and the squawking chickens. The man would typically lead his wife, often literally, with a rope or a halter looped around her arm or sometimes even her neck. This wasn't just for show, it was symbolic. It mirrored the way livestock were presented for sale, visually reinforcing her status as chattel, as property being transferred. Imagine the feeling of that coarse rope against your skin, the scratchy fibers adding insult to profound injury. He would announce the sale, often in a loud voice to attract attention. He might even list her qualities, how good a worker she was, how many children she'd borne, her general health. It was less a character reference, more a sales pitch for a beast of burden. The smell of the market, a mix of manure, stale food, and unwashed bodies would be thick in the air. The sounds a confusing blend of shouted prices, animal noises, and the low murmur of the curious or scandalized crowd. The auction wasn't always a dramatic bidding war like you see in movies. Sometimes, a price was already agreed upon with a potential buyer, and the public display was just the required ritual to make the transfer official in the eyes of the community. Other times, men would make bids, a few shillings, a handful of coins, perhaps goods like grain or livestock. One particularly grim account mentions a woman being sold for a pint of beer. Yes, you read that right. Less than the price of a cheap drink today. Did anyone protest? Did the women themselves have a say? Rarely. Historical records of these specific events are thin on the ground, but those that exist or the folklore derived from them paint a picture of female powerlessness. A woman's opinion on being sold was about as relevant as the pig's opinion on becoming bacon. Her resistance, if any, would likely be met with force or ignored entirely in the face of social custom and her own economic dependence. The visual was devastating, a human being reduced to an item of commerce, standing numbly or weeping openly while men haggled over her. They called it dissolving the marriage. It was a public execution of a woman's basic dignity. You've seen the public shame, now let's talk about the specific prices and the sheer indignity of the transactions. This is where it gets truly sickening. You saw the public spectacle. Now let's talk about the price tag they put on a human life because, spoiler alert, it wasn't high. We're talking ridiculously, sickeningly low. These weren't high-stakes auctions for rare goods. They were often transactions worth less than the vegetables being sold nearby. Historical accounts, often found in fragmented records or later folklore, speak of sums ranging from a few shillings down to mere pennies. Yes, pennies. A unit of currency almost worthless by modern standards, barely enough to buy a loaf of bread. One particularly cited account from the 18th century, reflecting customs that may have roots in earlier periods, even mentions a wife being sold for a pint of beer and a pack of cigarettes. Although that's later, it shows the degradation persisted. In medieval terms, imagine the price being less than a chicken or a decent shovel. They called it fair market value. It was the price of utter destitution. The transaction wasn't just about the money, however pathetic the sum. It was often accompanied by humiliating details mirroring the sale of livestock. There are suggestions that potential buyers would inspect the woman, checking her teeth, her limbs, her general health and appearance, much like assessing an animal's fitness for work or breeding. The feel of rough, calloused hands prodding you, the indifferent gaze of strangers evaluating you like a piece of meat. This was the texture of ultimate objectification. The sound of the meager coins clinking, the hushed murmurs of the crowd, the heavy silence from the woman herself, it all combined into a symphony of despair. The woman's consent in these situations was, at best, questionable. Even if she verbally agreed, it was likely under immense pressure, economic hardship, abuse, or the simple lack of any other perceived option in a world that offered no safety net. What choice did she have? Stay and starve. Leave and face a solitary death on the road. Being sold offered a potential, albeit miserable, form of continued survival under a different master. They called it a choice. It was a Hobson's choice served with a side of public humiliation. This wasn't about love or even affection. It was a brutal, visible transaction for labor and companionship born out of a legal vacuum and crushing poverty. Your car's trade-in value is probably higher than the price paid for some medieval wives. It exposes the horrifying truth. When you have nothing, you are worth nothing, except perhaps as a disposable asset. You've seen the price list. Now let's look at the long-term mess this created. Because these sales didn't exactly come with legal warranties or clean breaks. Okay, so you've just been purchased for the price of a decent chicken. What happens next? You didn't get a shiny new marriage certificate from the county clerk, because county clerks for peasant marriages weren't really a thing, and this whole transaction was spectacularly illegal in the eyes of anyone who mattered, like the church or the king. In the eyes of God and canon law, you were still married to husband A. This new arrangement with husband B was essentially living in sin. A fact the church was only too happy to remind everyone about, usually while collecting tithes. The sounds of the priests condemning sermon on Sunday would echo the grim reality of your situation. This wasn't a new, legitimate union. It was a legally invisible cohabitation, a partnership based on desperation and defiance of official norms. Any children born from this informal union, legally speaking, they were often considered illegitimate. While peasant communities might recognize them based on who raised them, in the cold light of formal law and potential inheritance claims, their status was precarious. Imagine the texture of legal parchment, stiff and official, completely ignoring the muddy, messy reality of your life and the children you bore. Sometimes, the mess created by these informal sales did eventually bubble up into the formal legal system, years or even generations later. This usually happened when there was a dispute over land, property, or inheritance, often long after the original participants were dead. Lawyers and judges would scratch their heads over conflicting claims stemming from a union started with a rope in a market square, trying to apply formal rules to a situation that fundamentally broke them. It was the official world colliding awkwardly with the unofficial, desperate reality of the poor. These instances in court records, rare as they are some of the key ways we know these practices occurred. They weren't sanctioned. They were problems the system eventually had to acknowledge because they left behind tangled webs of claims. The sound of the court proceedings, the dry rustle of papers, stood in stark contrast to the silent despair or forced stoicism of the woman at the original sale. They called it a private matter. It was a public wound left to fester. Still think filling out legal forms is tedious? Try having your entire life and family history potentially declared illegitimate by people who weren't even born when you were sold for pocket change. You've seen the legal headache. Now let's talk about how this horrifying custom slowly faded, not because everyone became nicer, but because other things changed. You've witnessed the sheer, unadulterated bleakness of a human being auctioned off like a broken-down plow horse. So, did this charming custom just continue indefinitely? Thankfully, no. It didn't vanish because everyone suddenly developed a conscience or started reading romance novels. Like most things in history, it faded because the grinding gears of society shifted, ever so slightly. The practice seems to have declined gradually from the later medieval period into the early modern era. It wasn't outlawed by a specific "stop selling your wife" act. Remember, it was never legally sanctioned in the first place. Instead, the legal system, particularly in England, slowly became a bit more effective, a bit more centralized. More importantly, the perception of what was acceptable in public changed. Public humiliation and spectacle, while still present in forms like the stocks or the pillory, became less about informal property transfer and more about official punishment. The church kept condemning it, of course. And perhaps, over time, their condemnation gained a little more traction, or people became slightly more fearful of eternal damnation as alternative economic options, however limited, started to emerge. The sensory experience began to shift. The sound of the auctioneer's shouts and the clinking coins were perhaps replaced by the quieter, but still potent, sounds of social disapproval and gossip. The smell of the market might still be there, but now mixed with a stronger odor of scandal that even desperate people eventually wanted to avoid. Economic changes played a role too, though not always for the better. As feudalism waned and early forms of capitalism emerged, particularly the enclosure movement that pushed people off communal lands, the nature of poverty changed. People were increasingly reliant on wage labor, moving to towns or working on larger farms. This shifted the dynamics of household economy. A spouse's labor was still vital, but perhaps the paths to survival, and thus the methods for dissolving a non-functional partnership, became less tied to the immediate, visible exchange of assets on market day. Consider the rise of the poor laws later on. While themselves brutal, they represented a different approach to destitution than simply allowing people to trade human beings like livestock. This slow, painful evolution of society meant the specific conditions that made public wife selling a desperate option. Complete legal void, crushing poverty, and the view of a wife as property began inch by agonizing inch to change. They called it progress. It was a glacial crawl away from utter barbarity. Still think modern bureaucracy is frustrating? At least you're not navigating the medieval legal system by trying to sell your spouse in the town square before the priest excommunicates you. You've seen the slow fade. Now brace yourself for the final, unsettling thoughts this topic should leave you with. It's not a happy ending, obviously. So that's it. No romantic resolution, no last-minute rescue by a knight who believes in true love. Just the cold, hard fact that for some people in the past, your value could be measured in pence, and your relationship status could change hands in a muddy field. This wasn't about medieval weirdness for the sake of it. It was about the brutal consequences of absolute poverty meeting a legal system that offered no escape and a society that viewed women as, at best, secondary citizens and at worst disposable assets. The texture of that rope, the smell of that market, the sound of those meager coins, these weren't just historical details. They were the sensory reality of profound dehumanization. You might think this is all safely in the past, a historical anomaly. But think about how we still talk about people as assets or liabilities, how economic desperation still drives people to impossible choices, how some still believe they have ownership over another person's body or life. The marketplace looks different now. The prices are calculated in clicks and views perhaps, but the underlying currents of objectification and powerlessness, they haven't magically disappeared. So next time you're complaining about relationship problems or scrolling through profiles, just remember the medieval market square. It wasn't just a place to buy food. It was a place where you could buy a person. They called it history. It was a warning.